One world currency.
The New World Order.
Those are the roots of trouble.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of election, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another live edition. It is July 30th, 2013. Wow, July 30th. Holy crap, did that go by fast. I know I keep finding myself saying that this year, but it's like every time I blink, it's like another month has gone by. Anyway, I want to get right into it, because tonight we have a ton of information to get out, and, 2 hours is never quite enough to get it all out. So, with that being said, let me introduce my special guest for this evening, who really doesn't need an introduction. He's a special guest quite often. He's actually not really a guest anymore. He's never really was a guest. He's always been a special guest co-host, I guess you could say. But he's back again with me, my good buddy, Mr. Steve Starr. Steve, welcome back.
Hey, thank you, Popeye. And again, it's good to be a guest because you do all the work, and I just get the enjoyment of coming on the show with you. Another big program tonight. The last time we covered this topic, it went viral on the internet, 500,000 hits, actually. And we've got more information than we did before on the Titanic. I believe that if your audience is a jury, Popeye, we're going to present evidence that will lead them to the conclusion that the Titanic was a deliberate act of mass murder. I mean, it was not an accident. I know a lot of friends are going to say, well, wait a minute. They just hit an iceberg out there in the dark someplace. And how can you say that was a planned situation? Friends, it wasn't the iceberg. One thing that's a major misconception about this, and we saw this last time, the Titanic was heading into a huge brick wall of ice, an ice flow that was about 60 to 70 miles long, even 4 to 5 miles wide in its location. It was like a wall of ice that they were going to hit after midnight. They happened to hit the iceberg. As a matter of fact, I believe, Popeye, the iceberg actually saved lives. Had they proceeded on at the speed of about 22 knots into the dark, way after midnight, they would have slammed into this giant brick wall of ice, and that's on the pictures of from the hearing, and you can see those for yourself. So the first thing you have to remember is the Titanic was not going to see the light of day. If they'd have missed 10 icebergs that night, they still would have crashed into this enormous ice flow. And we'll get into that and some other topics. I just wanted to bring that up right away.
Yeah, there's a lot of shadiness in regards to the sinking of the Titanic. The topic for tonight will be, was the Titanic sunk on purpose, and why? So stay tuned. The next 2 hours are going to be jam-packed. We'll be right back. So I've answered this question already. I've gone over this, the Titanic topic before. But never for the Unbound radio listening audience. I've done this before in the past, but never for the newer Unbound radio audience. So rather than keep harping on you guys and telling you to go listen to my archives, which I do want you to do, I wanted to, bring Steve on specifically to talk about the Titanic for 2 hours. And Steve agreed that he's even learned a few new things, and we've refined things even a bit more over the course of time, because it's been well over a year since we did a broadcast about this. So we felt it was time to redo it again, especially touch on everything that we already talked about, and refine everything a little bit for the Unbound radio listening audience. So with that in mind, a lot of people are probably looking at us right now, Steve, are looking at their computers or their phones or their however they're listening to us, the radio, and they're staring at it and they're going, the Titanic was sunk on what? On purpose? Why? Who and who would gain? How would they gain? And what would they gain from doing that? Well, those are good questions. And after tonight's broadcast, I'm sure you'll understand the motive behind it a little more, and I guess you could say the possible motives, right? Because without, according to official history, it's over. It was a horrific accident and everything. But if you're actually a researcher and you go actually read, and you actually do a little bit of research into this subject, you'll see it's very different. So anyway, I don't want to say possible. But I would say probable theories of what happened is what you're going to hear tonight. Anyway, first let's start off with the ship itself. So, Steve, the Titanic, huge ship, right? Huge passenger liner, a marvel of its time, hits an iceberg, sinks on the 15th of April, 1912. I think it was 1,507 people, if I remember correctly, killed on board the ship, and lost at sea, and between drowning and freezing to death, most of them froze to death in the water, because once you hit ice cold water like that, you got about 4 minutes, and then your body just shuts down, and then a lot of them just fell asleep, and then if you fell asleep in the water, you'd end up, and you sunk, then you'd drown, of course. But it was a disaster, and to this day, most people would say, "Are you nuts for even trying to say there's a conspiracy to it?" And I have to agree, Steve. When I first heard of this came about. My venturing into this came about from a reader who. This is before I was even on air. This is just when I was doing the website, and I was doing YouTube videos. Like once in a while, we were doing podcasts and stuff. And I had a reader message me and said, "Hey, have you ever heard of the Titanic Conspiracy? It might interest you. You should check it out." And I said, "The Titanic Conspiracy?" And they sent me a link, and I read this brief little blurb that was typed up about it. And it wasn't very informative, but it had alluded to the fact that the ship was sunk on purpose. And my initial reaction was, come on, everything can't be a friggin' conspiracy, right? So I was looking into it, and the more I looked into it, the more I found out how, there really was a lot more to it than what most people know. And you and I randomly had a conversation one night, and in this random conversation, the Titanic came up. And I don't remember exactly how it came up, but we both knew about the conspiracy, and we wanted to start doing these broadcasts to get the information out. And I remember the original one that we did on Bob Tuskin's radio broadcast years ago. And we had a caller call in and give us a piece of information at the end about an explosion on board the ship, which we had already enough evidence that we had shown enough evidence that there was an explosion. But he had said that they had found a section of the hull of the ship that was blown out. I think it was the French at the time had found it. So we looked into it, and it turned out that information was accurate. So, I mean, over the years, we've had to do repeated broadcasts. That's what led us to do the last one we did. Because the more you research into this subject, there's actually a ton of information out there. And a lot of people think that it's, I have seen researchers over the course of time now, more recently, and I would assume that's probably because of broadcasts that you and I have done and broadcasts that a few other people had done. Because when you and I first started talking about this on air, it was one of those taboo subjects, even inside the conspiracy community, and now it's more there's more people looking into it and taking the idea of it. Well, wow, maybe this is accurate. Maybe this could be real. Because to go back and look at something as far back as the Titanic, people go, well, who cares? And what's the big deal? Or people need to understand. And after tonight, you will. Anyway, so looking into this, originally I had thought that there's no way that this could be a conspiracy. And over the course of time, and I mean time because I've spent years researching this now, without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, it was done on purpose. I think it was a kill two birds with one stone thing, and we'll get into that with the insurance aspect of it. But let's start off with the sinking itself. So the ship sinks, Steve, and it supposedly hits an iceberg, sinks, and then most of the people that knew what was going on, we'll say, that night, behind the scenes, went down with the ship, including Smith. He died. But the end result of this whole tragedy is that nobody on board the ship was found guilty. In fact, the only person that was found guilty of anything was Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian, who wasn't even in charge of the Titanic or on board at the time that it struck said iceberg. So you have to wonder how he could be found. I mean, it's absurd when you look at it. And there's a lot of people that, yeah, you're right. They're right. He was the bad guy, but they don't really look into the whole inquiry itself and who stood to gain from the whitewash that was. A lot of people don't realize that, which you'll come to find out tonight. J.P. Morgan owned the White Star Line. Okay, and because he wanted to purchase the White Star Line, he had to make an agreement with the British government, and that agreement was that in a time of war, the White Star Line ships could be used as troop transports, and which, as you saw, some of the ships were used during World War I. Now, they already knew. That means that they had foreknowledge that World War I was happening, and that it didn't happen the way you're told, over the death of Archduke Ferdinand. You know what I mean? So that just goes to show that there's a lot more to this. Again, that leads to one of the reasons why they would sink the ship. But anyway, and by the way, I know people are going to say, how the hell could the sinking of the ship have anything to do with World War I? But you'll see. J.P. Morgan owned the White Star Line. Okay, so that's one of the big red flags right off the bat. He owned the White Star Line. He purchased it back in 1903. And then his original intent wasn't to buy the White Star Line, to build the Titanic, to kill the three individuals that I'm going to mention. But it ended up, that's where it ended up going. And a lot of times that's not why these bazillionaires get into, they invest in things. He invested in it because he wanted to dominate the North Atlantic passenger liner industry at the time, because it was a huge growing thing where people were taking ships back and forth from the U.S. to Europe. So he wanted to dominate it. I mean, like anything else he did, he wanted to control it monetarily. So he purchased the White Star Line. Now, years later, they have these ships made. They have three of them: the Britannic, the Olympic, and the Titanic. And the Olympic was actually the first one made. Correct, Steve? It was the
yeah. That's right. It actually launched initially October 20th, 1910, but that was mostly for show and trial runs and stuff like that. And then, of course, it had the mishap with the Hawk, but I'll let you go ahead and continue there, Popeye.
Well, yeah, the Hawk was the whole issue with the Hawk. A lot of people don't realize that the ship itself, the Olympic, it was huge. And it was already at sea before Titanic was finished. And it was out, and while it was out and about with Captain Smith, the same guy that supposedly later was piloting the Titanic, he was. They were passing the HMS Hawk, which was a royal, a military ship, a Royal Navy ship, and the Hawk was much smaller, but it was made to ram ships. It was it was an old school battleship. I forget what the exact term. It was a battleship, but they had a term for it. The front end had like a knife edge on it. And it was basically made for ramming bows and putting holes in other ships. That ship's whole purpose was to ram other ships. So it was passing by the Olympic, and the Olympic's propellers created such a pull that it actually drew the HMS Hawk into the side of the Olympic, and I believe it was the starboard side, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
And it punched a huge hole above the waterline and below the waterline into the ship, and it not only did that, it bent one of the prop shafts. I mean, they hit so hard it bent one of the propeller shafts, and it actually twisted the keel and tweaked the keel on board the ship. And for people that don't understand, the keel is the backbone of the ship. If the keel breaks, well, then there goes the ship. Now, if you've ever seen the way the movie it depicts how the Titanic snapped in half, it's interesting how you see the thing break and you see the sides giving way and everything. Well, the only way that the ship could snap in half like that is if the keel snapped. Okay? And they try to play it off that the keel snapped due to the weight of water, but it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, the ship just usually would have gone. When you see ships sink all the time, they usually go down in one piece like that. They don't break in half unless they have a weakened keel to begin with. Well, then then that would make sense. But we'll get into that in a minute. So the Olympic has this problem, and it's heavily damaged. Smith is the captain. Long story short, they bring it in, they check it out. The damage is so great to this ship, the Olympic, right? The Titanic sister ship, that it's uninsurable, and they realize that there's so much damage done to it that it's not even gonna be worth fixing it, because it would cost too much, and if this gets out, and this is gonna be the end of them, because it's all this money that was invested in, and it would be a real problem for Harlan and Wolff, the shipbuilders. It would be a real problem for the White Star Line. It would just be disasters for them economically, business-wise, everything. They would be, up the creek without a paddle, basically. So they, the idea, and this isn't something new, the idea that what I'm about to propose, this goes right back to the launching of the ship. So this isn't something that's new. But the idea that they had three ships, at least two of them, almost one of them fully built, and the other one almost fully built, the Titanic. The second one, well, the most common form of marine fraud even today is to switch ship names. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for them to have switched the ships, meaning they make the Titanic the Olympic the Titanic, and then they sail the quote-unquote Titanic out and sink it. That's really the Olympic, because the only way they'd get any money back is if they could sink it. But they couldn't, and get insurance money, but they couldn't insure it under the name Olympic, because it had already it had sustained so much damage, and it was noted because there was a Royal Navy inquiry into it, because it involved a Royal Naval vessel, and of course the Royal Navy laid the blame solely on the White Star Line, of course. So I mean, that would be like the federal government, like if the U.S. Navy had an accident with a cruise ship nowadays, they'd of course they would probably pin the blame solely on the cruise ship captain. I'm sure the captain of the Navy ship would probably lose his command or whatever, but regardless, he would get. I'm sure it would end up being the same way. So, again, White Star got blamed. So they had to figure out a way to recuperate their money, and the idea that they swapped the names for an insurance scam goes back all the way back to when they launched the ship. So this isn't something that's new. But this is an idea that's very old, to say the least, and this is not some guy making this up in his mom's basement. So now you have a basic idea of the horrific accident and the possibility of insurance fraud. Now I'm going to leave you there. When we get back, we're going to get a little further deep into it. So don't leave. Don't change the channel. Stay tuned. So as I said, a lot of you are probably going, who cares about the Titanic? It was over 100 years ago. Who really cares, Popeye? Well, you should care, because it's part of the history of what has led us to where we are today. Just like you would want to know the history of the Federal Reserve, the meeting at Jekyll Island. Well, that actually takes a big place in this story, we'll say. Anyway, because remember, this ship was sunk in 1912. The meeting in Jekyll Island took place in 1910. Okay, so they already knew that they were going to form the Federal Reserve. But I'll get there. Hold on, we're going to get there. So I've discussed the idea with you all, okay, of insurance fraud. Which, as I said, the idea of insurance fraud and switching the names of the ships, the Olympic and the Titanic, that goes back all the way to the very beginning of when they initially launched the vessel and the Titanic got underway. Okay, so this is not something new. This is not something that's made up by, some dude, like I said, who, they loved it. And I always use this analogy because that's what the powers that shouldn't be try to, get you to believe in your head that people look like who talk about this stuff. But, it's not some dude in his mom's basement wearing a set of boxer shorts with a tinfoil hat on his head. This goes a lot. The idea that at least that they switched the names for insurance purposes goes back to when the ship was originally made and the people that were working on board the ship. I mean, there are families that have come out, over the course of time that said that their grandfather said to the father, and then the father said to the son, passed this little secret on over the course of time that yes, they did switch those ships. And at the time, nobody said anything. The workers didn't say anything because remember, this is 1910. I mean, times are hard. Life is rough. Back then, if you don't have a job, that's literally a death sentence. Nowadays, people are like, "Well, I got a job," but there are what they call social safety nets right now. They didn't have that back then. There was nothing. There was no Social Security. There was no unemployment. There was none of that crap. You didn't have a job. You didn't eat. You didn't eat. You died. Capiche? Okay, so not having a job was a death sentence. So literally, they didn't have to threaten to kill them. They just said, you'll never work again in your entire life. And at that point, that would have been a death sentence. And to anybody that's under that pressure, you have a family, you have a wife and kids, you got to feed them. What are you going to do? You're going to keep your mouth shut. These guys are poor, laborers. They're not super rich people that can go afford to go take care of themselves. The middle class that people know of today just didn't exist. Was not around. It did not exist, period, at all. Okay? There was no... it's just times were very different. Okay? So it's understandable how these people were quieted up. But the idea that they switched it goes all the way back then. Now, it wouldn't have taken much to switch it, and there is evidence that it was switched. For which I'll play a little bit of audio for you in a bit. But one of the big things that people point to in the switching of everything in the ship, one of the big things is the name of the ship. Now, the White Star Line had a tradition when they built ships that they would engrave the name of the ship actually into the hull plates of the ship, rather than taking a piece of steel and cutting it out and then riveting it. They literally engraved it into the hull plates. Now, interestingly, the Titanic, and I'll play a little bit about this, but in a bit. But Ballard, when he went down, one of the things, I think it was in '86, he went down with the French, and one of the things that they discovered was the name on the back. Some of the letters had literally fallen off. Over the course of time, a couple of the letters had fallen off. And you could see an M and a P on the ship. Now, there's a video out on the net that shows some of the footage from the dive, and I don't know if the shot of the M and the P is from actual footage of the dive or if it's like a CGI rendering of what they saw. But you get the idea that they've known about this for a while. And you should also look into why, the top secret mission Ballard was on. Yeah. The whole thing. Anyway, I mean, it's really shady, Steve.
Yes, it is. It's shady all the way. Everything about this is shady.
So, well, I was just my point of focusing on the letters, I kind of got sidetracked that the break's going to sneak up on us. But I got sidetracked on the letters for a second, which I'll play the audio for everybody in a minute. But I was trying to give an example of how. There is evidence out there that the ship names were switched, and it wouldn't have been that hard to do. And there's a lot of other evidence, like the amount of portholes on certain parts of the ship. But we got the break sneaking up on us, so don't go anywhere. Stay tuned for the next 2 hours, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so I laid the groundwork for the idea that the possibility that they switch the names out for an insurance scam, and that's just basics. We're going to get into more detail in a little bit, but like a wishbone or the letter Y. This whole event has, at least in my take, two things that come together to form one. Okay, so I've shown you the one side of the wishbone or the one side of the Y. Now let's show you the other side. Let's show you the other branch that sticks off. So I've talked about the insurance aspect. Now let's talk about the three people that brought, at least, if not more, and Steve and I are going to touch on that too, but at least three people that needed to get taken out. And what better of a way to do it than with the backdrop of a ship disaster? Now, once I explain this aspect, you'll see how they, and we'll get into this too, how they merge as one. You know, like Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste. But three men in particular were invited to be on board of Titanic. Now, from the research I've done, they did pay their own way. They paid their own fare, so it wasn't like they were given free fare. But I'm sure that they were probably sent an invite. Hey, don't miss the grand voyage of the most grand sailing vessel of all time, and blah blah blah. And a lot of these rich guys, I would love to go on board that ship and tell Morgan blah blah blah. At least sit down with him and say, it's a beautiful ship, but who cares? You know how these rich guys are. They go back, so they know how to lure one another in. So they sent out invites to a mass of people. Most of the people on board that ship, a lot of them were at least on board Titanic, were the hoity-toity elite at the time, right? Or some of the elitists at the time, we'll say.
Sure.
And the bourgeois, and you have three individuals in particular. Now, you brought up somebody else, and that sparked me to think of somebody else too. But the three individuals right off the bat that I could see that they would want to get out of the way, these elitists, which the families, you still see remnants of their families today, would be Isidore Straus, Benjamin Guggenheim, and John Jacob Astor. Now, a lot of people would say, why would they want those people out of the picture? What do they what do they stand to gain from taking these three individuals out? Well, those three guys alone were worth well over what today would be, considered $1 billion. Okay, and that was back then. It was, like $500 million or something like that at the time, which in that money, this is pre-Federal Reserve, so at that time, $500 million was just an incredible, disgusting amount of money. So, these guys are very powerful. They have very huge fortunes. I mean, Guggenheim, everybody knows that name. I don't think I have to, even explain who he is. John Jacob Astor was another well-known, I don't want to, well, I guess you could say millionaire, but I guess today's standards would be billionaire, whatever. And then you have, Isidore Straus. He was one of the brothers that formed Macy's, right? So you have very powerful individuals with a lot of money, big purses, we'll say, with very, very deep pockets in them. Now, these guys, some people believe that their speed bump in the road to the Federal Reserve was a patriotic thing. They knew what was coming to this country. No, they really didn't. They're just like the rest, because their families are still, some of them that you see remnants of today, like Anderson Cooper, the Vanderbilt clan. Same idea. Anyway, the families, the remnants, you still see them playing along in this agenda today. So it's not like they were against the idea of the elites running things or anything like that. They realized if this little plan had gone together that these guys, these elitists, these certain group of elitists were planning to do, and they weren't invited to the meeting, remember. So that means that their interests, their money, any of their financial assets, stocks, physical assets, is all at risk. Their future of the future of their lineage is at risk. The future of all their businesses is at risk, right? Because now you have this idea to put in the central bank. They're not stupid. They know it's going to devalue the real value of money, and their fortunes, because they're not in on it, right? Their fortunes are going to go. So, of course, they would have stood up and done anything they could to stand in the way as a speed bump to the formation of the Federal Reserve. Well, what better way to, as I said, get rid of them than to bring them on board of a ship that you know you're going to sink? Now, a lot of people have asked me, Steve, they've said, well, Popeye, how would you know that they could get all three of those guys on board that ship and to stay on board the ship? Well, there was the whole gentlemanly aspect thing back then. They actually would have done the right thing where it's women and children first. But there's also the aspect of you could have, one or two or even three assassins on board to make sure that those three guys never got off that ship. And, it would be to do it under the cover of, while the ship was sinking. They could have gotten them in their staterooms. They could have shanked them in their ribs. Obviously, they probably wouldn't have done it with a gun. They would have done it with an ice pick or a knife of some sort, something to get them in the lungs maybe a couple times. And then look, it's been done in the past to other people, especially under the mass confusion, to make sure that those three guys died on board the ship, because once they die, then, now you have the family and all their businesses up in, upheaval, and they can just roll in and they could buy the assets up, which, ironically, J.P. Morgan ended up doing. He ended up buying a lot of the assets of those three gentlemen up, in the years to come. Now, isn't that interesting? This is the same guy that owned the White Star Line that they all died on. But color me kooky, because as an investigator, I look into that and I wave the red flag. What say you, Steve? I mean, right off the bat, right off the bat, there's enough evidence to point to that there's foul play here.
Okay, well, we're talking, for one thing, about some very powerful people who weren't involved with the Jekyll Island meeting. They weren't involved with the plans to create the Federal Reserve. They had their own private interests, as you said, Popeye. Guggenheim was very involved in mining and metals. He was also... his brother, Simon Guggenheim, was very famous out here in Colorado. He started the School of Mines, okay? We had people like Molly Brown, a silver magnate on there. Now, you remember, of course, that J.P. Morgan had a very large amount of gold at that time, and it actually helped after he crashed the stock market and done a number of other things, helped the United States government by allowing them to use or lease his gold to back currencies for a short period of time until they regained their own resources. But, gold and silver, people knew a lot more about gold and silver backing of currencies back in 1900 than they do today, Popeye. I mean, we have dumbed down 100 years in this aspect. And really, I'm not trying to propose a gold and silver standard, particularly because of the limits of those metals. But we have to have some sort of backing, and today with this fiat currency with absolutely no backing, you can see what happens with the banks stealing trillions of dollars. Anyhow, Guggenheim was another one of those people, like John Jacob Astor, who was independent. And so there was a good reason to want to remove him as well. His brother being a senator at that time from the state of Colorado helped the Colorado University get started and the School of Mines. He was married in Denver at 1892, but he went all the way back to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Okay, Astoria Hotel. All right, now so he's connected with the Astor family. And so these guys, John Jacob Astor, who had a lot of money, who was an inventor of his own, and who was very interested in working with Nikola Tesla about developing energy sources. Now, you got to remember that they were invited to be on this ship with their good buddy J.P. Morgan, who owned the White Star Line, who had his own very, very special private suite and quarters there on the Titanic. But J.P. Morgan suddenly disappears at the last minute. He says that he's ill, but he turns up vacationing in France with his young, frolicking fiancée. And it turns out that J.P. Morgan was not on that ship for some strange reason. So it's like King Herod, we mentioned this before, inviting all of his
Ismay's
friends.
wife, too, by the way. She was supposed to be on board the maiden voyage, and at the last minute got too ill.
Yeah, we'll talk about Ismay. We'll get into him, too. But it's like what we said before in our other show, Popeye. It's like King Herod inviting all of his friends to a party and then barring the door and burning the place down to eliminate all competition and then taking over estates and taking care of the families after this tragic fire killed all these people. I mean, as we've talked about before, these guys are psychopathic in their intent to achieve power. And they do eat their own. They're very cannibalistic about getting rid of people who don't want to flow with the plan. Now, Astor, of course, was working with, had worked in the past. Nikola Tesla was staying at the Astor Hotel there in New York. He had a free room there. He'd kind of fallen out with John Jacob Astor during the time that J.P. Morgan was funding, some of his experiments. But when J.P. Morgan found out that he couldn't put a meter on all the free energy that Tesla wanted to provide, well, he dumped Tesla because he was working with Rockefeller in oil. He was working with Edison in electricity, and he didn't like, the kind of free energy that Nikola Tesla was talking about. So, John Jacob Astor was going to kind of get back with, Nikola Tesla on his way back. So you have a whole energy thing that's happening here that's bigger than most people can possibly realize. This thing that happened with the Titanic is far bigger than anybody has any idea of. I am challenging James Cameron to go back to the Titanic. I'm challenging you, Cameron, go back down there. I want to see those plates. There are 2 big pieces of the hull, 3/4 of the mile. This ship broke into 4 pieces. It did not snap in half, ladies and gentlemen. It broke into 4 pieces, 2 big hull pieces, a stern and a bow. And we have not heard the last word from Mr. Cameron and this whole slipshod, deceptive thing that happened there with the Titanic. We're getting ahead of ourselves. But anyhow, back to the whole thing here. I hope I answered that question, Popeye. And, I'm just rambling here, but, I'm hot under the collar about how bad this situation was.
Well, a lot of people don't realize the depth of what happened. It's like throwing a stone into a pond and the ripples that go across the pond. I mean, this one disaster by itself, first of all, it financially, as I said with the insurance aspect, it saved because the ship sunk and within 5 days they got, I think it was like $12 million or whatever. And again, at the time, it was a ton of money. Harlan and Wolff and White Star Line was covered financially, and then J.P. Morgan, looking into the future, knowing what they were doing, because obviously they already had plans for the Federal Reserve and World War I, they benefited on that level too. And then when they, because now these guys that were in the way of the Federal Reserve, or would have made a speed bump and maybe slowed things down, maybe not stopped it, but maybe slowed it down enough so that things wouldn't go on with the way they wanted it. So then they're killed. They're dead. Now, interesting that the sinking, what's the date of the sinking, Steve?
The date of the accident was the 14th of April, and the Titanic sunk on the 15th of April.
Wait. What day, Steve?
The 15th of April, the same day that Abraham Lincoln died when he was shot on the 14th of April. And it's the same day that, if you know anything about the 15th of April, you know that that's the day your taxes are due. Remember, we didn't have the IRS before the Titanic sank. So there are some occultic dateline connections to this as well.
The Boston Marathon bombing took place on April 15th.
I didn't know that, huh?
Yes. Dude, I couldn't make any of this up. Hello?
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, we've talked a lot about the background, why they would have wanted to create this, and we'll get into the forensics of this, because I know people are saying, you guys are crazy to say that this ship just ran into an iceberg in the middle of the night and went down. When you hear of all the cascading errors and all of the improbable things that happened that led to this disaster, you can't help, I think, I can convince a jury as a prosecuting attorney, on circumstantial evidence, Popeye, this was planned. This was planned. That's exactly what they intended to do.
Well, now you have the idea of who they wanted to kill. At least 3, perhaps even more than 3 people, Molly Brown and others. Wait, it gets even more interesting. All right, so you got a little bit of the insurance aspect of it, right? The basics, right? I've laid the groundwork for that. Now I've laid the groundwork for who they would have wanted to murder. Now let's merge them together. Well, like Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So it could have gone something like this. They're planning already, and this would entail multiple people, i.e. it would be obviously a conspiracy, but they were already obviously planning on sinking the ship for insurance purposes. I don't think that they planned on killing all those people on board the ship. That probably pushed them to actually cover it up even more. I think the idea was to kill I'm sure that they thought certain people might die in the sinking of the ship. Some of the lower class people, in steerage and some of the workers, but they don't care about those people. But they did plan on getting some people off of the ship, which we'll get into. So it could have gone something like this. They're sitting in a smoke-filled room. They're having their brandy and their cigars, and you have a couple of representatives from Harlan and Wolff. You have a couple of representatives from the White Star Line, perhaps J.P. Morgan himself, or somebody representing him, probably, more likely. And they're all having a conversation, Ismay. What are they going to do? And they come up with the idea of switching the ship names and then sinking it. And they'll have they'll be able to insure the Titanic, and then they'll send the ship out on its way. Oh God, it hits an iceberg. They steer it into an ice field, which at the time was not an odd thing to do, which we'll get into. And it hits an iceberg. Oh, what a horrific tragedy. The ship sinks. A few people die on it, and we get paid out. And they don't really care about the lower class people that die because they didn't care about them at all anyway. They looked at them like they were vermin. So obviously they would get the higher end passengers off. And then if you have J.P. Morgan or a representative thereof involved in these talks, well, obviously J.P. Morgan himself is going to know what's going on, right? And then he's sitting there and goes, I have a bunch of people that are in the way, and the only way that we'd be able to absorb their interests or anything afterwards would be if they were dead, because there's no way that they would sell their stuff to us while we were alive and give up their fortunes and everything else and blah 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 blah. So they'd have to die. Now people have said, well, you could easily send out assassins to do it, but don't you think that would look a little shady to anybody that had half a brain, looking into it, or others in the elite community, that suddenly these individuals that might stand in the way of the formation of a Federal Reserve banking system that these bankers are trying to put together suddenly all die in mysterious, a car accident, or one is found dead in his home. It would just be easier if all three of them tragically died under the guise of the sinking of the ship. And you could easily have murdered the three of them, and then the ship sinking is just the backdrop. And of course the crime scene disappears into the bottom of the ocean along with the three murdered bodies. So, what better way to do it?
Absolutely. I mean, right now, look at JFK, RFK, MLK. We're talking about Hastings. We're talking about Andrew Breitbart. We're talking about all of these people. I mean, every one of these guys has a serious question about what happened. We know these were assassinations, of course. And, obviously, in some of these cases where we're seeing journalists like Hastings being killed, there's serious questions being raised. If you're going to kill somebody like J.J. Astor or Benjamin Guggenheim, you're going to get rid of people like this. There's going to be a lot of questions, especially at this time. So never let a good disaster go to waste. They're going to put all these people on the boat. They're going to get them all together, and they're going to try to take them all down at once, and they're going to make it look like an accident. And the attempt was to make it look like an accident, and they succeeded. They succeeded even more than they thought they did because of the iceberg, which was the hitch of the whole plan, I believe, Popeye. They were intending, just like the book that was written in 1998, The Wreck of the Titan, written by Morgan Robertson. There's a book called Futility.
You mean 1888?
1888. I'm sorry. Yeah, 1888. Get that. Every time we say that, it was 14 years earlier. A book was written called The Wreck of the Titan, which mirrors this entire thing. 14 years earlier. Now, Morgan Robertson was kind of a dime store novelist, okay, and he had written a lot of books and made a little bit of money, and he had written this one but couldn't really find a publisher, so he published it himself, and there were a couple hundred copies out there, and it never really went anywhere while he was waiting to see if he could get his big deal. But after the story of the Titanic came out, he republished this, and of course he ends up poisoned in a very short period of time afterwards, because the whole Titanic mirrors identically the way that the Titan was sailed right into a huge ice flow, rolled over on its side, blew out and filled up full of water, and then slid off the ice like a dead whale.
And I wouldn't say that it was predictive programming. I would actually say that was probably, they probably found, being in the shipping industry, somebody probably came across the story and, hey, sir, look at this. And they thumbed through the story and their jaw hit the floor and they went, oh, an epiphany hit. Let's mimic the story. Hence why when Morgan realized that the reality of the Titanic mimicked his story, he dies of poisoning not too long afterwards. Very, very shady indeed. All right, ladies and gentlemen, first hour just flew right by, but don't go anywhere. 59 short seconds. Steve and I will be right back, and we're going to be getting even further into it. There's even more information to back up what we've been talking about. So by now, the end of hour one, you should at least be questioning the official story of the Titanic sinking by now. By the end of hour two, you're going to be like, okay, they sunk it. At least I'm pretty sure you will. Anyway, we're back in 59 seconds. Don't go anywhere. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 here on tonight's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Popeye from FederalJack.com, hanging out with my good friend and guest co-host for the evening, Steve Stars. Steve? Welcome.
Yes, sir. Here we are.
Welcome back for hour number 2, brother.
We're welcoming everyone back for hour number 2 because we're going to present some very powerful forensics. We have teased them with motive, and now we're going to lay out some very, very powerful facts that people need to know, that we've even studied and come upon in our work, Popeye, even being more convinced after what we've looked at. It's like when you study 9/11 or anything else. You know, you begin to look at one thing, and then you start to see something else and something else and something else, and that's just the way this is accumulated, hasn't it?
Yes, and by the way, I don't want anybody to walk away from this thinking that this is the end-all, be-all research that you should do on this subject. The whole point of me doing this broadcast is to inspire you to go research this. You know, you'll understand more about the reality of things, and what researching this will, it'll help you see a lot of things. It'll help you understand that they run by the same playbook. Okay, they might change certain names or players or key points of what they do, but the basics of the playbook are usually generally the same. Okay, and it'll also if anything, I know people that this has served as a waking point where they weren't, I don't know about 9/11, and then they started looking into they were already Titanic fiends. And they started looking into the aspect of the insurance fraud and the killing of at least those 3 individuals, if not more. Like you said, Molly Brown, the silver magnet. You got to remember, you're looking at people. By the way, and this is a point I forgot to make in the first hour there. The people that they were targeting, if you notice, their business wasn't finance. It was like she mined silver, and silver was used for money, but it was mining. It wasn't the people that were killed weren't involved in finance. You see, now obviously maybe they because they planned on going after the gold and the silver and everything later on. Maybe this was a preemptive way of just getting her out of the way. Who knows? But the point is that the people that were killed they didn't make their money from finance. They made their money from industry or mining. You know what I mean? Like steel or mining or, railroad, things like that. Not finance banks, not loaning people money and getting interest back, which is money from nothing. Those were the people that were trying to form the Federal Reserve. J.P. Morgan is a prime example of one of those people. Whereas the people that were killed were not in that field. So I just forgot to, when I was mentioning the 3 individuals, Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss, I had forgot to mention the fact that and it's important to note that, because when you look at it and go, well now, and don't forget, Morgan came in and ended up eating up, all of the interests over the course of time, or at least a good portion of them over the course of time. So, gained from that aspect as well. All right, quick short break, and then we have a nice long segment coming up. Don't go anywhere. Steve, you brought up Morgan Robertson's book, The Futility of the Titan, and originally years ago I had wondered if that was like predictive programming or whatever, because they do that stuff now today. But further research, and like I said, over the course of time, you have a better understanding of things. I've come to the conclusion that they probably used Morgan's story as a basis for, how to get rid of the ship. And then,
Yeah.
when he realized that they just killed him because he became a liability, he knew too much. Interesting. The book, A Night to Remember, which led to the movie, which led to the basic premise of what people know today as the mainstream story of the Titanic, and what Cameron's, your buddy, what his movie Titanic is based on there. The book A Night to Remember, which, remember, again, this is the official story of the sinking of the Titanic. It was written by an ex-CIA agent named Walter Ward.
Yeah, Walter Lord, who wasn't any relation to Stanley Lord, by the way, but yeah, I didn't know he was ex-CIA, though. I didn't know that.
Yeah, but there's nothing there to that, right?
Well, it sure seems strange, doesn't it? Yeah.
Why would an ex-CIA agent have anything to do with... Right, well, I mean, I understand that some of these, maybe he was bored, but I don't know. It's just a little shady to me. Sorry.
Well, there's a lot of things that were going on, of course, with all this. But, there's another person. Did we talk about Archibald Butt on the air?
No, you mentioned him. He's another important person to talk about.
Yes, this is a very important person that died on the Titanic that nobody knows much about. His name was Archibald Butt. He worked with the Roosevelt and Taft administration. He was a very highly respected envoy, diplomat, on a trip to the Vatican. He went to Rome to meet with the Pope very shortly and booked his ticket back. Now, if you know anything about what's going on here, and we've talked about these kinds of things before, Popeye and I have, World War I is being planned, friends. This is 1912. It's still 2 years before the war is actually going to start to break out. But the bottom line is it's going to be a very big naval war. And Archibald Butt was a very big person in terms of his diplomatic relations, his envoy. He was passing messages, no doubt, between the Roosevelt administration and the papacy. They're wanting to know, is the U.S. Navy going to be involved? Because remember, how did we get involved in World War I, Popeye? Wasn't it some sort of a naval thing, as I recall? Lusitania, that's right. Okay, so the bottom line is there was a very big...
And why don't you look who owned the Lusitania?
Yeah, there's a Cunard ship at that time. And, the thing is...
who owned the Cunard Shipping Company?
Well, I'm not sure who was Cunard at that time. I know they did. Eventually, they merged with White Star, and they became Caribbean Cruise, by the way.
J.P. Morgan owned them.
Didn't he? I think he was just... I thought he was only in IMM and... a couple of the others, but I know he owned White Star. But the point is simply that at this time, what you had was a development of who is going to be playing along with the naval game here. So, you can speculate as to why this important envoy and diplomat from Washington was there in the Vatican and on his way back to Washington, D.C. He was also killed on the Titanic, another very important person that most people don't recognize in this scenario. And then, of course, we talked about others. But, the thing that we ought to talk about the most, I think, Popeye, is the fact that the Titanic was on a doomed course from day one. From day one. There was no question about where the Titanic was going to end up. It was going to end up in the middle of heading through a big, huge brick wall of ice. This ice flow, and you can see maps and pictures of it on the internet. There are actually photographs of it, but you can see the map that was used. All the ships in the area knew it was there. Now imagine this scenario for a moment. Okay, let's say you're a pilot, and you're going to fly the brand new jumbo jet from Paris to New York. Okay, and you're going to have a lot of diplomats. Elton John's going to be on board, and a lot of other people. It's a big celebration for a brand new jumbo jet. Well, as you're getting ready to fly, the next day, early in the morning, you hear that there has been a volcanic eruption in Iceland. And the volcanic plume is spewing out directly into your path. I know what you're going to do. You're going to fly that brand new jumbo jet right through that volcanic ash, tear the hell out of the engines, and crash it. Isn't that what you're going to do with it, Popeye? I mean, now look at 1912 wasn't the Stone Age, friends. They had wireless communications. There were ships passing through the North Atlantic all the time. It was not uncommon, as Morgan Robertson had written about in his book 14 years earlier in 1898. Not 1998. 14 years prior to the Titanic, he had written about a ship called the Titan running into this ice flow. Everybody, they didn't have the wireless then, okay? Everybody knew it was out there. The Mount Temple knew it was out there. The Burma warned them that it was out there. The Californian crossed the path of the Titanic, headed south, and would not go into that area, even warned the Titanic, okay? All these ships, the Frankfurt and the Carpathia, of course, which responded to the emergency, but all of these ships knew that this ice flow was out there. You cannot sail a ship right through the middle of Cuba, friends. It won't work. You can't sail a Titanic, and Popeye has already pointed out what happened to the Olympic. These ships had eggshell hulls. Eggshell hulls. They were hardly unsinkable. And we've said this before on other shows, Popeye, you could practically sink one of these ships with a sledgehammer. All you had to do is hit it on the seams 4 or 5 times and split the seams open, and the next thing you know, you've opened up a gap. I think the metal was about 3 inches thick at max in some places, riveted.
Yeah, but they knew that. They learned that from when the Olympic collided with the Hawk. I mean, the Hawk was built to pierce ships, but the magnitude of the damage they were surprised at, because it literally knocked plates off of the ship, further down the vessel. And that's how they realized that the keel was bent, because that meant that the ship was flexing. And all you had to do was get the ship to flex to get those plates to pop. That's how weak that outer shell of that ship was. So combine that, now you have a weak outer shell combined with an already damaged ship, because, again, let's say for an instant that it is the Olympic and they switch the names, right? You have a ship, which, by the way, when the Titanic set sail, I forget the name of the passenger, but there was one of the passengers on board. He was telling everybody that would listen that the Titanic had this list to port, and certain people, it's recorded. Like I said, this guy was running around telling everybody. So there's people that remember this, and this guy survived, and he even said that yes, he remembered the ship since from the time they set sail having a list to port. Well, guess what ship had a list to port because of the damage? Olympic. Yeah. So now you have a damaged ship with a weakened keel. And by the way, it was further weakened. Olympic wasn't just damaged in one accident. There was a second accident where it threw another prop, and that's where, when it went back to the shipyard, they switched, because there was no more props for it. They took a prop from the Titanic and put it on the Olympic, prop number 401, which should have been on the Titanic, but it wasn't. They used it. It's known. It's in the records. They used the prop stamped 401. Which would have been for the Titanic, but they used it for they put it on the Olympic because it had thrown when Smith was piloting it. I don't remember if it was low if it was either like low water and they hit the bottom of the channel, or if there was a shipwreck or something below them that they had passed over and they hit, but it ended up catching the prop and ended up throwing the prop. And when it threw the prop, it caused such cavitation and the vibration through the ship that it literally caused more stress on an already weakened frame and hull and the keel itself. Right. So now you have an already damaged ship being even further damaged and weakened. Now it's sent out to sea. It wouldn't have taken much, and for an already weakened keel. To snap it, all you would need is an explosion of decent, an explosion of big enough size would blow it in half. But all you need is an explosion of even a mediocre amount in the right spot to put enough torque or twist on it, and boom, that thing would snap. It's already on the breaking point, and they know that. And by the way, when the Titanic left, there was a fire on board the ship. And it was burning the whole time. It was in one of the coal bunkers up in the front.
Yeah,
which is the same spot that Paddy the Pig, one of the sailors, and some people have said that there's evidence to show that he might have been making things up. Maybe he knew people that were on board the ship, and that's how he got the information. But this guy said that there was a hole up in the front of the ship. Up in the bow, in the bow section of the ship. And when they went down to Titanic, they found a hole where he said it would be. I love the explanation that it's just a coincidence that it's in the same spot that he said it was, and it has nothing to do with any of his story at all, which was the fact that there was a fire in one of the coal bunkers, and that there was an explosion on board the ship, and that the damage, the fatal damage wasn't done to the ship via the iceberg. The iceberg that they hit was another, when you look into it, you find out it was almost like a Murphy's Law moment, that they weren't supposed to hit that berg. From the research I've seen, it was what I think they call it black ice or black icebergs, where the bottom gets so eroded over the course of time by water, the top heavy iceberg flips over, and the white snow-covered, top becomes submerged, and what comes up is this glassy, like substance, because it's ice, and at night, like the surface is glass-like, I should say. And at night, even with the moon out, you're not going to see this thing. It would appear as just like a black spot. And if you've never been out at sea at night, you can't understand how dark it can be out there when there's no lights. All right? Yes. Trust me, I was in the Coast Guard. I understand. Anybody that's been in the Guard or the Navy or in the Marine Corps knows when you're out at sea in the middle of the night, and you're running with no lights and there's no moon. It's dark. I mean, you'd have to you'd be lucky if you could literally see the water in front of you. It gets kind of creepy. So out there, if you can't see until you're right on top of it, you could definitely miss an iceberg that had flipped over and had this glassy top. So there's the and there's some evidence, and there's the idea that's the iceberg that they hit. Again, like Steve said, they weren't from all recorded, the track and the ice field map. They were headed for this wall of ice. The front of the ship would have actually been able to handle they were built to handle a front impact, and the ship probably wouldn't have sunk if it had had a front impact as opposed to grazing along the side, which is where the damage was done. And the ship probably wouldn't have hit. There's evidence to show that at the last minute the engines were put in reverse because they wanted to port around. The helmsman was given the order to port around the iceberg, and even though it sounds like they would go around the port side of the iceberg, that's actually not true. What they did was they went around the starboard side, but it's kind of like they swing the ass end of the ship out, and they would have actually, if they had done it the right way, they would have cleared the whole berg. But for some reason, the ship's engines were put in reverse, and by doing that, it had the exact opposite effect and almost drew the ship into the berg, and then that's why it right along the side of it. So there's question as to why that why that was done. That's interesting. Why were the engines put in reverse at the last minute? We could speculate on that, but for all intents and purposes, they were going to park this thing up on this ice shelf, and I think that they were going to park it up on the ice shelf and then let it sink. Yeah. But they were going to get everybody off into the Californian, which we'll get into in a second, because we got about 30 seconds and the break's going to sneak up on us. But we'll get into when we come back in from the other side of the break, the Californian. But I think that they were going to park this thing up on the ice shelf and then evacuate who they could onto the ice shelf into the boats. And then have the California come in and rescue everybody, and then the ship would be, either stuck on the ice or eventually, blip, blip, blip into the blue it would go. And by that time, whatever damage was there, it was done. The broken keel, the twisted keel, it was done from the impact with the iceberg. We'll have to let it sink. We'll have to scuttle the ship. Which is probably more along the lines of where they were going to go with it. Or at least that's the idea, anyway. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We'll elaborate more when we get back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. So I've laid out the case, with Steve's help, again, of A, the insurance scam, B, the idea that they wanted to murder certain people on board the ship, right? Now, I mentioned the Californian, Steve. And I mentioned Stanley Lord earlier, and I said that they blamed everything on him. Stanley Lord was the captain of the Californian. Now, according to the plan, again, this is just from doing research and understanding how people work and how things operate. Part of it is a bit of speculation, I guess you could say, but some of what I'm going to bring up is actually in a movie. There's a couple different documentaries you could find on YouTube. There's two of them that I know of. There's also a talk that We Are Change, one of the We Are Change chapters over in England did, or Europe somewhere did. But one of the movies you could watch is called Why They Sunk Titanic, and you'll hear some of what we're going to talk about in there, and you can go research. They'll tell you where they actually where you can find it, and then you can go do the research yourself. You can go even look at the transcripts from the trial at the time, or the hearing, whatever you want to call it, into the accident itself. But Lord got blamed for everything, and it's interesting because if you understand how everything went, he would have been a key player in this. And I say that because he was the captain of the Californian, a ship that set sail at a time when there was a coal strike, and you couldn't get enough coal to get any ships underway at all. And yet this guy has enough coal to get underway, and you would think, well, during the middle of a coal strike, if he's getting underway, there must be some super important cargo on board his ship. Yeah, there was nothing on board his ship except 3,000 woolen blankets and sweaters. Now, if you understand what I just said, if you take a minute to think about what I just said, there was no cargo on a cargo vessel except for 3,000 woolen blankets and sweaters. Now, what would you need 3,000 woolen blankets and sweaters for? Why would you need an empty cargo vessel? It was a makeshift rescue vessel. Okay, so obviously there's foreknowledge. So, and when you look at what happened, the Californian was out in the middle of nowhere. It steamed out into the middle of nowhere and then just stopped. And it was waiting for the distress signal from the Titanic. And it was the distress signal the Titanic used was they were supposed to use red, white, and blue. And there's the story, which I want to get into, Steve. I want to let you tear apart. I'll let you get into on the other side because we only have about 2 minutes left before the break comes up. But there's the story of the Samson, which they tried to use to cover things up a little bit. But basically, the story is that the Lord didn't see the red, white, and blue rescue flares from Titanic. He only saw white, and Murphy's Law kicked in, and they happened to be too far away from each other, and he missed it. And the story of the Samson is that there was supposedly this illegal seal fishing vessel that happened to be in between them, and the white flares that Lord saw from the Californian were him recalling his fishing boats back to the little small boats back to the mothership so they could get out of there. You said that that's garbage, and I'm going to let you tear that apart. Like I said, on the other side when you have a few minutes to get into it. But the whole idea is that they blame Stanley Lord for not coming, in time and rescuing people. So it's his fault. Don't blame the navigators on the Titanic for hitting the iceberg or anything like that. Don't blame Captain Smith. Don't blame Bruce Ismay. Don't blame anybody else. No, blame the guy that wasn't even on board the ship. And the fact that he went along with it goes to show you that he obviously knew something and didn't want to let it out because, what would they have done to his family? Right. What would they have done to his career otherwise? I mean, who knows? Obviously, he was, and even, you got to figure, even if he said that it wasn't his fault and he came out and said, no, there was a conspiracy, he would at least be alluding to the fact that he was part of this grand conspiracy. So he would still be convicting himself, He would still be sitting up there and admitting that he took part in this vast conspiracy. So it wouldn't clear him either. It'd be better for him to just take the fall for the sinking of the Titanic. It was a horrific accident, and that's what happened. Stanley Lord is the popular villain in this story. All right, I'm going to pause it right there. When we get back, Steve's going to rip into the Samson. Don't go anywhere. All right, so I don't think that it's Lord's fault. I think it was Murphy's Law kicked in to a certain degree. I mean, again, I think the original intent was to nail the ship head on into the ice, this ice sheet, because if they could do that, that would explain the tweaked frame, the tweaked hull of the ship, the tweaked keel, if it didn't break the back of the ship completely. And then they could just, if it was still out there and they sent out a salvage crew or whatever, I'm sure the insurance company would just tell them to they would just scuttle the ship, or I'm sure they would have plans to scuttle the ship and then just, it's sunk, but they'd be able to get most of the people, if not all of them, off between the ice shelf and then the Californian coming over. I think it became like Murphy's Law between hitting the iceberg and then they were so far off of the courses that they actually thought that each other was on that they didn't see. I don't think Lord. I think his crew. I don't think they saw the red, white, and blue because if it wasn't the Samson, if the Samson wasn't there, then why wouldn't they go? Well, perhaps they only saw the white flares. Perhaps they couldn't see the red and the blue ones. I'm not fully sure as to why they wouldn't go. I mean, I know they wouldn't do it purposely because of they hauled ass over there when they got up in the morning. I think it was a mixture of between the wireless being off because they shut it off after midnight. Between that and then for whatever reason they didn't see the flares because they said they only saw white flares. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they did see the colored flares and they just misreported them and they were the lower officers. It could be a case of them covering their butts. Remember, that ship, the Californian, was also owned by J.P. Morgan, so you could have had the right people on board there too to make sure, maybe to slow up the rescue process. Who knows? The point is the ship didn't get over there in time. I wouldn't say to blame it all on Lord. And again, in this story comes the story of the Samson, Steve. Now, the story right now that's out there is that the Samson was an illegal seal fishing. It's a seal fishing vessel. They were illegally seal fishing at the time, and they just happened to be in between the Californian and the Titanic, and they were firing off white flares, which is what Lord saw instead of the flares from the Titanic. And it's due to the curvature of the Earth, by the way, because they were so far apart, and the way the Earth curves, they couldn't see. So, what's the deal with the Samson? Because I don't want to give people disinformation. For whatever reason, the officers on board the Californian didn't see the red, white, and blue flares. Perhaps maybe somebody on board the Titanic was only firing white flares, and they weren't firing off red, white, and blue flares. I mean, if you want to make a disaster worse, all you got to do is have the right person in the right space at the right time to do one small thing, and you can make things really bad. But I don't want to digress too much. The point is, it's not. I don't. Lord is the popular villain of the historical version of the Titanic disaster, but I don't think he's the villain. Now, the Samson, Steve, what's the deal with the Samson? Because, like I said, it's supposedly this illegal fishing vessel, but they didn't come out until well after the sinking and the review. The captain didn't come forward until later on, right?
Yeah, the whole story about the Samson is so ridiculous it's hardly even worth taking the time. You can just Google Samson Titanic. You can come up with the webpage, and there's several articles here and several things. In 1963, our author Leslie Reed conducted a search of shipping records in Iceland and found that the Samson was actually in port in Isafjordur on April 6th and again on April 20th when she paid her dock taxes. Okay, there's just nothing to that story. I think getting back to the Californian, though, is more important because, as Lightoller says, the second mate on the Titanic, it was the Californian that crossed the bow. The Californian radioed the last ice warning to the Titanic, and they were rudely rebuked by the officers on the Titanic, or Bride and Phillips, who were the Marconi people there, who were trying to catch up on customer.
They were more concerned with the customers, the passengers, sending telegrams to their loved ones in the city and taking care of their rich customers than they were about taking warnings from other ships. Which, when you look back on hindsight, is like, what are you guys, idiots? Yeah. But that's what the telegraph operators were doing. I mean, it's.
That's what they were doing, and they were busy, and of course. But the Titanic also, there's another mysterious series of events concerning why the wireless went down on the Titanic for almost a day. Bride and Phillips did some unconventional, uncompany policy things to get it up and working again, but I still don't really know, and I don't think there's much information because certainly Bride did not tell anybody a lot about it, but for some reason, this brand new wireless system on the Titanic misfunctioned shortly after they left port in Belfast, and then it was out for a little while, but they got it up and working again. The Titanic received no less than 9 ice warnings. Now, you have the Mount Temple out there on the other side of the ice. They just barely got through the southern end of it during the day at a slow speed. They're also a smaller ship that can navigate much easier, and if they bump into a little bit of ice and some growlers, they can probably get around those things. It's not like the Titanic with this paper-thin hull at 22 knots heading into the dark, okay? Another ship that was there was the Frankfurt. The Burma actually wired that we are backing out of the ice. They backed out of the ice. They didn't even try to turn. They backed out of it because it was that bad. Everybody knew that this big, huge island of ice, friends, and you can see it on the map. If you look at the map, Google the map, Titanic ice flow or Titanic ice flow direction, and the hearing investigation as they put this up in the hearing in the courtroom to look at what was actually happening. The Titanic, I'm going to repeat this again, because people don't get it. Popeye, 98% of the people will not remember what we're saying. The Titanic was doomed. It could not have possibly survived the night. It was heading into a huge island, an ice flow, an ice cap, if you like. In warmer months, ice breaks off from the northern parts up by Newfoundland, Greenland, and it gets into these flows, and what it does is it jams up during the day, and then it melts a little, and then it freezes at night, and then it melts a little, and then it keeps moving. It's just churning its way down to the south. This thing was almost 70 miles long from the top to the bottom, and the Titanic was heading right into the middle of it. They just happened to hit an ice growler on the way in that split the seams. Now, James Cameron says something very interesting in the anniversary copy of National Geographic's Titanic 100-year anniversary. He says, this is what he says: when you look at the Titanic, you're looking at a crime scene. Okay, I'll say it exactly to verbatim. You can read this for yourself in the article. It is a crime scene. He doesn't say like a crime scene. He says a crime scene. You have the knife here and the gun over there. Now, what he's talking about, I believe, he's talking about the knife that slit the port, or the starboard bow. That's the iceberg. Then you have the gun, which blew the guts out of the ship on the surface. And now there was a lot of controversy because just like with 9/11, people were saying there were explosions. There were explosions in the lobby in World Trade Center 7 before the big buildings fell. All these things happened. The American investigative panel found that the passengers were saying there was an explosion, the ship broke in half. The British said, no, it never broke in half. Well, we know now it didn't break in half. It broke in 4 pieces. 4 pieces. Now, 3/4 of a mile from the main wreckage, and you can see this online if you go Google the Titanic wreck field and you can see the pictures. There are 2 very large pieces of the hull, including the keel, as Popeye and I have pointed out. The keel plate is leaning face up. You can actually see them in some of these films. Okay, the size of both of these are about the same. They're roughly square, but they go across the middle of the ship. They're about 26 to 27 feet in ship length. And
it's a section of the ship that goes. It takes the entire beam of the ship, and it's like, which is from side to side, and it's literally. It's as if like a 40-foot section of the ship, and I'm not talking 40 feet side to side. I'm talking like full side to side, 40 feet in length of the ship was blown out from underneath the bottom half of it.
Right, 2 pieces, 26 feet, about 26 to 27 feet in ship from about astern, ship length, 92 feet in ship width, meaning it went all the way across the bottom of the ship.
Full beam.
The full section of this part. Now imagine, if you take it, let's say you take a tin can and bend it in half, and you want to snap it in half. If you snap it in half, is it going to break into 4 pieces? Well, that's what the Titanic did. It broke into 4 big pieces. It broke into the bow, which obviously plowed into the mud. We've seen that. The stern, which mangled and ended up facing the other direction, just a short distance away. And then these 2 large pieces of the hull and keel that were 26 feet in ship's length, but all the way across the width, about 92 feet. They're roughly square. how those two pieces broke out of the bottom from the essentially the entire width of the bottom of the ship at about 26 feet in length, 92 across the bottom of the ship. How these two pieces broke out and ended up 3/4 of a mile from the rest of the wreckage is the question, okay? Now, as James Cameron points out in his Last Word documentary, the ship was far... The breaking of the ship was far further aft than they thought, and the hull was not 25 degrees or 45 degrees sticking out at a 45-degree angle. The engineers speculated it was only about 19 degrees, which brings up the point that you talked about earlier, Popeye, that most of the time ships will just, like the Oceana, if you ever saw the way it sank, they'll go down the same way, and you'll see the hull and read the name of the ship as it disappears. The stern goes underneath the water. Now, some people say, well, the ship just bent in half, because it couldn't take the weight. Well, it was only 19 degrees out of the water. Now the props were clear, as the passenger said, but it wasn't that high up, and it was further aft than they thought it was, further to the back of the ship. So what happened there was something blew the bottom out of that ship, and that's what really took it under. Now, whether it was cold water hitting those hot boilers, whether it was a coal fire that was burning down there and exploded, or whether there was something else that severed those pieces, I don't know. But I'm challenging James Cameron to go back and find out why those pieces are there. Now, he presents this almost ridiculous theory that these two pieces were kind of dangling loose and twisted, and they flapped like a bird and then split apart underwater. Now, he admits that they broke apart at the surface because they're quite a distance from the rest of the wreckage. Okay, well, I don't think that's what happened, because first of all, two big pieces of hull are not going to flap like a bird in water. I mean,
I know that the section is located near where the coal bunkers were, and all you'd need to do is have hot water pour into either the coal bunker itself or even into the boilers.
Yeah. When you can actually see, as he points out from the map, you can see what he believes is almost the direct point above the surface where the ship came down, because of the heaviest parts of the boilers and the bunk would come down almost directly straight on down. And the two pieces of the hull are almost 3/4 of a mile away, so they're quite a distance there. And you can go over, and they've actually shown us some photographs, and it looks to me like they're severed pretty cleanly. They were saying, well, look at how they were twisted apart. And I'm looking at, man, it almost looks like somebody cut them with a torch. I mean, these things are virtually square. How did two big pieces of the hull, and we're talking about keel included, as Popeye pointed out, the strongest part of the ship, keel in the middle.
Which was now weak, too. So, I mean, it wouldn't even take a huge explosion to take the keel out and snap it.
Yeah. Whatever it was, it sure busted right through cleanly. In my opinion, I don't think it tore. I don't think it was a rough edge. It looks very, very cut like a knife to me. I mean, I'm not an expert, and that's why I'm saying that Cameron needs to go back down there. I challenge him to go back down there and tell us the truth about the Titanic. I think he avoided. Now, getting back to the Californian, he didn't. The only reference he had in that film, due to the fact that there were still lawsuits going on because of the Titanic descendants and survivors and people like that with the Californian issue, even up to 1995, he did not even mention the Californian. And the thing we were talking about before is, who was Stanley Lord, Captain Lord? What was going on here? My guess is that he was a company man following orders. He got himself into trouble when he got back into New York. Some of his crewmen started talking to the press before everybody had been debriefed. Then he found himself in serious trouble about the location, his position, where he was, what he saw, and why he didn't respond. We can get into that later.
All right, Steve, I'm going to pause this right there because we got the break sneaking up on us. Ladies and gentlemen, do not go anywhere. Final segment coming up. Man, 2 hours went by fast. Stay tuned. So 2 hours is definitely not enough time to talk about the details of this, and I wouldn't expect to be able to fit everything into 2 hours. The whole reason that I wanted to do this broadcast again, the Unbound listeners, I know you guys haven't gotten a chance to hear the Titanic. You've heard me mention it, but I didn't, I haven't done a broadcast on it since I've been here on Unbound. But the whole goal is to urge you to go do the research yourself. There's hours of research you have to do. There's Why They Sunk the Titanic, which is a good documentary. There's another one, I think it's called Conspiracy, Was the Titanic Sunk, or something to that effect. just like look up "Was the Titanic Sunk on Purpose" on YouTube. By the way, you're going to see the older shows that Steve and I have done. I suggest you listen to them because there's things that we got into on those shows that we didn't in tonight. Tonight's goal, what I wanted to do was, instead of getting into attacking, blaming the captain or talking, getting too far into some of the more detailed stuff, which we weren't able to get into, like the Jesuit connection, which there's a huge Jesuit connection to this, and I urge you to go check it out. I mean, the captain himself was a Jesuit, so you have to go check this out. But I didn't want to come at the listeners tonight from that aspect and just be like, oh my God, the Jesuits did it, because then people are going to be like, oh, kooky conspiracy theory. I wanted to present you with just the evidence, the logical evidence, without even getting into the deeper end of the conspiracy pool, because this does go over to that end. But without even getting into that part, I can show you that there's more than enough evidence that this was done on purpose. Once you research this and you start to look into it, you'll realize that there's a big Jesuit connection. But I wanted to kind of, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up, but I wanted to kind of go over it on a very basic level and show people that even at the very basic level you can look at this and be like, wow, there's a ton of proof that at the very least they did it for the insurance end of it. And, did they plan on killing all those people? No, the rescue plan went awry. It went wrong for a multitude of Murphy's Law reasons, but it went wrong. And, Stanley Lord ended up taking the blame for it. And, after a while, I'm sure the officers and everybody on board the Titanic figured out what was going on. And as the captain of the ship, you're supposed to be the last one off the ship. So it would have looked bad for him if Smith had gotten on board one of those lifeboats. They already knew that they didn't have enough lifeboats if they were fully packed with people to save everybody on board the ship, let alone how they were launching them half-assed, half loaded, quarter loaded. So I'm sure the gravity of the situation set in very fast, and Smith didn't die valiantly with the ship. He probably went into the wheelhouse because I'm going to go down, I'm not going to go down, I guess he'd want to go down where the captain should be, right? Because he realized he was done. He realized there was no getting out of it. If he goes into the water, he's going to die anyway, and there's not enough room for him on a lifeboat. And what's he going to do? Toss some woman and her kid overboard so he can get on board one of the lifeboats? Yeah, that wouldn't ruin him. Look what happened to Ismay. He got on board Bruce Ismay got on board one of the lifeboats, even though he was told not to. He got on board one of the lifeboats, and for the rest of his life, his name was Mud. To use the expression from Dr. Mudd from the Lincoln assassination, which is another thing Steve and I have talked about. Right, yeah. But Steve, we have about 2 minutes before the end of the broadcast. Final thoughts, and anything you want to throw out there that maybe we haven't gotten a chance to get into.
Well, I think what went wrong with the Titanic situation for the people who planned this mass murder was that they hit the iceberg before they hit the ice floe. That caught everybody off guard. It was a WTC-7 moment, just like what happened with 9/11, when WTC-7 wasn't hit by Flight 93 or whatever bomb they intended to use in there. They were stuck with a situation. I don't know how much Captain Lord knew. I do know this, that Lightoller and the passenger said it was the Californian. The crew member said they saw the flares. Now that we have seen the box of flares, and we know that there were all different colors used because we've done them, you can see what was supposed to be in there. 3 reds, 3 blues, 3 greens, 5 whites, and there's 3 whites, 2 reds, 1 blue. We know that they were sending off all different kinds of flares every minute, as Lightoller says. Why they didn't respond, we don't know. I think it was one of those minutes of confusion where Lord was probably told, look, just signal the Titanic for the last time, shut down everything, and await orders for in the morning. I don't know what he knew, but I do know he got caught off guard because whatever happened here certainly wasn't what he was intending. In the morning when he was in the wreck scene, they beat it the hell out of there before the Carpathia showed up, and then they said they were a long ways away. Another fallacy. The point is simply this. There are speculations, friends, and then there are facts. There are 4 pieces of the Titanic down there, 2 of them 3/4 of a mile from the rest of the ship.
And by the way, when Ballard went down there, they found steel. He had the blueprints from the Titanic. He found steel cross braces that weren't on the blueprints and shouldn't have been there. The only way they would have been there is if, perhaps a repair was made, a temporary fix was made. Well, the only ship that I could think of that looked like the Titanic that had any temporary repairs made to it was, again, the Olympic. And when you watch Why They Sunk the Titanic, they talk about it in the end. It's at 47:44 is the clip where it starts, where they talk about this, where Ballard found when Ballard went down there, and that's also when they supposedly found the nameplates that had fallen off, and it said the M and the P on the back. So, ladies and gentlemen, look into this, okay? I'm glad we were able to bring the Titanic Conspiracy to the airways for the Unbound audience. We're out of time. Steve, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Look into it further. Love you all. We're out of here.